So I want to introduce to you Professor Caitríona Beaumont, Professor of Social History at London South Bank University. And I want to introduce her to you through several lenses, and I hope that together those will create an appropriate picture and an accurate picture of her work and her contribution. So through the lens of Kate's educational journey. So Kate was awarded a BA Honours in History and Politics from University College Dublin, and she went on to do an MA in Modern Irish History there. After that, she secured ESRC funding and a University of Warwick Graduate Award to undertake a PhD in Social History at the Centre for Social History at the University of Warwick. Let me introduce you to Kate through her work and her publications. Kate is an expert on the history of female activism and women's movements in late 19th and 20th century Ireland and England. Her 1997 journal article, Women, Citizenship and Catholicism in the Irish Free State, 1922 to 1948, is currently in the top 6 most read and in the top 14 most cited articles in the international peer-reviewed journal Women's History Review. Her first monograph, Housewives and Citizens, Domesticity and the Women's Movement in England, 1928 to 1964, that was published by Manchester University Press, was reviewed in the Times Higher Education as, and I quote, a refreshing perspective on women's activism in 20th century England, enlarging and challenging our study of the past. Overall, Professor Beaumont has published more than 20 articles and chapters on the history of Irish and English women's organisations and activism, and she's presented work at over 70 national and international conferences, seminars and workshops. As a result, her work has had a major impact on this field of study in Ireland, the UK and beyond, redefining orthodox understandings of the women's movement. Let me talk about Kate's service to the Academy. In September 2021, she was elected as a trustee and a council member of the Royal Historical Society, and in January 2022 was awarded a visiting fellowship at the Centre of Excellence in History of Experiences in the University of Tampere, Finland. She is currently co-lead of the Expertise of Experience Collective, a network of 14 academics from across the UK, and co-editor of its planned edited collection, Histories of Welfare, Experiential Expertise, Action and Activism in 20th Century Britain. What about her contribution to this university, to LSBU? So Kate was the Director of Research in the School of Law and Social Sciences from August 2015 to July 2022. And if you can do the maths, that's for 7 years. So she was the Director of Research for 7 years. During that time, one of the things she oversaw was the successful submission of the school's unit of assessment for REF 2021. One colleague who was in one of the leading roles of that REF submission said, Kate was instrumental in our whole REF submission. Her contribution went beyond LSS and was evident in the inclusivity of our return. In 2020, Professor Beaumont set up and chaired the LSS working group, Keeping Research Active, enabling and sustaining research activities among colleagues with caring responsibilities and or disabilities during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the impact of this was vital because the impact of this was to introduce additional financial support in LSS for eligible colleagues. And the findings of that working group contributed to the establishment of the new LSBU Inclusive Researchers Group. you can see her work on gender, on middle-aged and older women, underpinning wider contributions to LSBU, and particularly to the menopause at work policy that was started in 2021. One of her colleagues says that we can almost play menopause bingo with Kate, because it's her last mission to make everyone at LSBU aware of the menopause and the impact that this has on colleagues. And so consequently, she takes every opportunity to mention the word menopause at least once during every meeting. So perhaps I think I'll do my best job of introducing Kate through the way that her colleagues talk about her. One of her colleagues said, "Inclusivity runs through Kate's contribution like a stick of rock. She's the sort of person who asks uncomfortable questions, who stops us falling into the usual narratives, and we are all the better for that." So please join me in welcoming Professor Beaumont to deliver her inaugural address.
Thank you very much, Deborah. I just checked, am I audible? Is that okay with everyone? And at the back? You can. I'm not sure where the microphone is, but you can hear me okay? Yeah, good. My voice is I'm just recovering from COVID, so my voice is a wee bit thing, but as long as, are you able to hear me okay, Sue?
Can you come closer to the big black box a bit? Move that way, that's it.
Is that okay with, I think that's better, yeah. Is that okay for the camera? Yeah, okay, good. Is that all right? Okay, I'll stay fairly put. Okay, so many thanks to Deborah for such a lovely introduction. And thanks to you all coming out this evening. I'm sure you've all had really busy days, so I very much appreciate that you taking the time to come and hear my lecture this evening. So it's great to have you all here. And thanks particularly to my family and friends, some of whom have been sitting in the front row there. You've been outed. Especially my other half, Patrick, and our 3 children, Donal, Rosa and Martha, who have come back down from university, so there's some tutor somewhere going, why aren't they in class? So, sorry about that. And to my sisters who have come along. And I think it probably is the first time that the aforementioned have had to sit through one of my formal lectures. They've heard quite a few of my informal ones. So I would just like to say to them, don't panic, it'll be over soon, so it'll be okay. So I want to say thank you also to my dad, Pierce, who being nearly 90, wasn't able to make the trip over from Dublin, but just to thank him because he has supported, he's a constant support for everything I do. So as I was preparing, not working. Oh, there you go. Right, so as I was preparing for this lecture last week, I realised it's actually, I'm into my 25th year now of working here at LSBU. And I was a bit rather childishly, was really pleased to find a 25 in the colours of the Irish flag. So I was really quite chuffed with that, so I put it in on the slideshow, so that's why that's there. And I think that is something to be celebrated. It's a long time, but it's something to be celebrated. And so I wanted to take the opportunity this evening to say thank you to some of the colleagues and some of my colleagues and students, past and present, who have made working here at LSBU such a meaningful experience over the years. And it really is because of them I have stuck around this long. So thanks in particular to colleagues in the Division of Social Sciences and the School of Law and Social Sciences. And here I'd like to pay a special tribute to Dr. Lawrence Marlowe, who was a fantastic mentor to me when I first arrived here back in 1988. And I'd also like to pay tribute to to Dave Edwards, who was Lawrence's partner in criminology, quite literally, who went on to become my head of division, and who was always incredibly interested and supportive of my research. Now, Dave sadly died earlier this year, and some colleagues here will have known him, but he isn't forgotten. And I did manage to find this photo of Dave at my book launch, which was held here back in 2014. Now, I know he looks like he's not having a particularly good time, but he did really, for some of the others who were there. He did enjoy himself, but I just like that photo. It's a nice way to remember him. I'm grateful also to Marissa Silvestri, who I see over there, my former colleague and now great friend, who was an ideal office companion. She may not feel the same, but I did, for many years, and who has talked me through many a work dilemma. And thanks to my former dean, Professor Craig Barker, who can't be here this evening, but for the last 7 years has been very encouraging of my work. And thanks then to my current acting dean, Professor Patrick Callaghan, who's also the Associate Pro Dean Research for the University, for his confidence in me over recent years. So in my role as Director of Research, I had the pleasure of working with colleagues across LSBU, so I escaped out of LSS, and in particularly with our research office, with our library and archives colleagues, and with our events team. And these opportunities have really been a wonderful experience, and I have made very good friends through that work. And I wanted to say a particular thank you to Neil Hudson-Basing of our events team, our events manager, who's organised this evening's event, but who has been a great friend and ally to me in all my years working here. I don't know if Neil's in the room. He's probably out doing something outside. But anyway, just to say thank you to Neil. And then lastly, my thanks go to colleagues in human resources, equality, diversity and inclusion and well-being, who I worked in 2021 to devise the LSBU menopause at work policy. And in particular, Caroline Evans in HR, who ensured that this important new policy was adopted. And it is something I think that LSBU can be very proud of. And actually, we were ahead of the tide. You may have seen, oops, sorry, went the wrong way. You may have seen in The Guardian this morning, the all-party parliamentary committee on the menopause reported, and one of its recommendations is that there should be free health checks for all women over 45. And Caroline Harris, MP, who is the chair of this committee, came to LSBU and launched our own LSBU menopause at work policy. And we had a really great event with Naomi Paxman, who I think is here. I can't see her, but I think she's here, but who played her ukulele, which is always fantastic. So thank you to Naomi for that. And anyone who is playing menopause bingo, there you go. You've had your first shot. So I am that predictable. So, right, so I always think it's good to have a plan. If I could actually work out to use these right. So, my plan for this evening's lecture, I decided that I would borrow from what's known as social movement life cycle theory. Now, this seemed like a good idea last week, although I was suffering quite badly from COVID. But then, after I had the slide made, I was so chuffed to have a graph on one of my slides, because I don't usually use graphs, that I just left it in there. So that's the reason why. So those of you who are not familiar with social movement life cycle theory, if any of my students are here, you should be familiar with this, because I teach this quite a lot. So it's a way in which sociologists and political theorists, it's a theory that they use to map the trajectory of social movements. So I have mapped on this trajectory to my own career. So you can see here it has 4 stages. The first is emergence. So I'm going to talk a bit about how I came to develop my career as a feminist and social historian, how that emerged, and how that developed and then coalesced, so kind of came together through study, research, publications, and the way in which I impact on the field of women's studies. Now, I am going to gloss over bureaucraticization. I'm going to spare you that, because that really would send you all off to sleep, the experience of the bureaucracy of working in higher education. So we're going to skip over that. However, just to keep in line with the graph, I would say that yes, I've had some success. I've certainly had some failures. Some co-option, not too much repression, thankfully, and I really hope I've never gone mainstream. So but you can tell me that if you think I have later. And then finally, I want to contest, because that's what we academics like to do. We like to contest theories. I'm going to contest the concept of decline. And in my case, as a middle-aged woman, I'm going to talk instead about my new research project, Beyond Women's Liberation, which happens to be about the lives of middle-aged and older women. So I'm going to talk about the future rather than decline. So, God, I'm really going to get the hang of this. Right, okay. So growing up in Ireland in the 1980s made me a feminist. My own personal moment of consciousness raising was, somewhat ironically, thanks to the Catholic Church and Catholic social teaching, which at that time remained omnipresent in all aspects of Irish society. I was 17, a practicing Catholic, so still going to Mass regularly, in 1983, when the first referendum on abortion took place. And sitting in church, hearing the rights of women and girls so undermined, and seeing these views replicated in the media, wider society, and in a constitution that confirmed bans on abortion, divorce, and access to birth control, despite the obvious need for these things, led me to reject Catholicism. It also resulted in what has turned out to be a lifelong interest in the women who stand up and say, this isn't fair, this isn't how society should be, and this is how we can change things. And the women who participated in many different ways in the fight for gender equality. And of course, this fight is still happening, with women and girls having to take huge risks to stand up and protest against gender inequality, as we've witnessed with events in Iran over the past 4 weeks. So in 1985, I went to University College Dublin to study history and politics. But it wasn't until my third year that I had the opportunity to take a course on women in Irish politics. And the fact that that module was offered on the politics side of the degree highlighted the absence of women's history on my history degree. So when I had the opportunity to study an MA in modern Irish history, I jumped at the chance to research and uncover the ongoing activism of Irish women in the 3 decades, the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, following the establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922. So in this work, I challenged the perception that sites of female activism and protest were only to be found among the individuals and organisations that participated in the suffrage movement in Ireland, that's the campaign for the women's vote. Instead, I looked beyond these post-suffrage feminist societies, important as they undoubtedly were, and found a number of often overlooked organisations for women. For example, the Joint Committee of Women's Societies and Social Workers, the National University Women Graduates Association, and the Irish Countrywomen's Association. So these organisations were not overtly feminist, and they embraced and supported women in their traditional gender roles and in their traditional domestic role. Nevertheless, they continued to campaign to enhance women's lives long after the partial extension of the parliamentary vote for women in Ireland in 1918 and on equal terms with men in 1922. In my work, I argue that these groups must also be included in the histories of the women's movement. So the research that underpinned my MA dissertation was published in a number of book chapters. Yes, I got it right that time. Yes, a number of book chapters, and here the book cover is here, you can see. And also in journal articles, one of which Deborah mentioned, in Women's History Review. And this work contributed to the development and expansion of Irish women's history and the history of female activism, and continues to act as a reference point for new research, something I'm always really delighted about. So in 1991, I moved to the UK to start a PhD at the University of Warwick, and inspired by what I had discovered in my Irish research, and having disproved, as one Irish commentator had noted in the 1940s, that Irish women had gone out to vote for the first time in 1918, went home, and then nothing happened, I wanted to challenge the long-held assumption that the majority of women in England, after the winning of the vote, similarly retreated from public life or moved away from the women's movement in the interwar years. Oh, sorry, this is going round and round. So for this project, I focused on 6 voluntary and mass membership women's organisations, which are listed here on the slide. And through my research, I demonstrated that each did make a significant contribution to the campaign for women's rights throughout the period from the 1920s up to the early 1960s. In doing so, I triggered a reframing of traditional understandings of what the women's movement represents. This rethink placed women's agency centre stage and demonstrated that the women's movement could no longer be limited to the study of post-suffrage feminist pressure groups. Instead, the movement was inclusive of a wider range of women's organisations that were not party political and not public, and which did not publicly identify as feminist. So I published this research in my 2013 book, Housewives and Citizens, the cover is there, and also published a number of book chapters and journal articles that looked at particular aspects of the campaigning of these 6 organisations. For example, their demands for better housing, reproductive rights, women's health, and participation in the interwar peace movement. And again, just there's some book covers there. And in addition to these publications, I have also enjoyed opportunities to share my work beyond academia through the media and on other platforms. And again, here are a few examples. So I made a short film with Channel 4 News. I've published on the British Library's website. I contribute profiles to the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. And I have some work published on the International Encyclopedia of the First World War. So taken together, my Irish and English research has challenged the long-standing wave metaphor, invented in the 1960s and still often used by historians, sociologists, and political scientists to map the trajectory of the women's movement. I'm sure some of you, no doubt, will be familiar with the terms first wave feminism, referring to the women's suffrage movement of the late 19th century and early 20th century, and second wave feminism, representing the women's liberation movement, which emerged in the late 1960s. And I'm sorry, this is a wee bit fuzzy, but this is a manifestation, a visualization of the wave metaphor. So what I've shown through my research is that the history of female activism is much more complex and much more messy than this simple wave metaphor suggests. Large housewives associations and other groups continue to campaign, often successfully, for women's rights between the so-called first and second waves. So this is happening in those little dips in between. And I would argue that that undermines the value of this once useful, but in my view now outdated model. Now, of course, I couldn't have done any of this work, looking back at my work, without the support of many academics and collaborators over the years, historians of women who have provided inspiration and practical support along the way. In particular, I'd like to mention the late Dr. Margaret McCurtain, a giant of Irish women's history, who took an interest in my work early on and who facilitated a number of my first publications. I'm also immensely grateful to Dr. Margaret Ward, whose own work confirmed that there was a historiography of Irish women, and after hearing her come to speak at a conference at University College Dublin in the late 1980s, gave me the confidence to think that I too could be a historian of women. And having moved to Warwick University in 1991, I was very lucky to meet Professor Maria Luddy, another leading historian of Irish women, whose kindness and encouragement made the lonely life of a PhD student more bearable. And Maria, along with Professor Pat Thane, who I'm really delighted that Pat is with us this evening, Maria and Pat acted as the examiners for my PhD, and both have provided me with substantial support and advice ever since. So, yes, sorry, Pat, I do keep coming back to you with emails saying, would you do this for me? Would you do that for me? But she always does, and I'm very grateful. So, sorry, my COVID cough is kicking in, and I'll just get some water. So I've outlined, that's the emergence and the coalescence, so we're getting through it, so we are getting there. And as we agreed, I'm skipping over the bureaucraticization. So just before I move on to talking about the future, and not the decline, because we're not doing decline, I want to mention 3 other projects quickly, and Deborah did touch on these, but I just want to mention them quickly, that I'm working on currently. So, with Dr. Ruth Davidson and Dr. Eve Kolpas, I'm co-editor and contributor to a new book entitled, as Deborah was saying, Histories of Welfare, Experiential Expertise action and activism in modern Britain, which we just really this week have pretty much confirmed. I don't know if I'm over, yes, I think sorry, Eve is over there giving me the nod. We are going to be publishing with the Palgrave Studies in the History of Experience series, and we would hope that would come out in 2024. And that's been a great experience. We've got working with 12 other academics on really exciting new research. And as Deborah said, myself and Eve and Ruth as editors are spending a month in Finland to prepare the final manuscript. I do hope, Eve, that you might be learning some Finnish, because I certainly aren't. So I'm hoping you're going to sort me out there. And I've also been working with Ruth Davidson and Dr. Anne Logan and Dr. Anna Muggeridge on a participatory research pilot project, which was funded by UKRI but distributed by LSBU. And that involved the Tunbridge Wells Club of the Sauroptimists International of Great Britain and Ireland. And for those of you who might not know, the Sauroptimists means the best of women. So the Sauroptimists are another historic women's organisation whose history of activism has too often been overlooked. In conjunction with Sauroptimist members in Tunbridge Wells and Kent, the project identified how the club could better promote its own rich history of activism for gender equality and measure its impact on its local community. And we have a funding bid currently under review to expand and develop that project across England and Ireland. And we're waiting to hear. So hopefully that might be successful. And then the final project mentioned here is in really early stages, but I couldn't resist including it. I'll explain why in a moment. And that's going to be, excuse me, a new interdisciplinary publication, this time edited by sociologist Professor Louise Ryan, who is a great friend, but also someone who I've had the privilege of collaborating with and publishing alongside a number of times, and Dr. Eileen Hogan of University College Cork to mark the centenary of the Jazz Age in post-independent Ireland. And this collection has emerged out of a really successful and fun conference that took place in Cork a few weeks ago, and I just do think that that is the best title of a conference that you're ever going to get. I dare you to dispute that. And it was wonderful. So that's an exciting new project. So, sorry. So now I want to turn back to Beyond Women's Liberation, my work in progress, and a project that I have wanted to embark upon for many years. That's a bit where the bureaucraticization comes in the way of this project, but I'm getting there now. So in the conclusion to Housewives and Citizens, I acknowledged that more research needed to be done on the activities of the 6 and voluntary women's organisations featured in the book in the post-1964 period. I was particularly cognizant of the need to trace the interconnections between these long-standing women's groups and the newly emerging women's liberation movement. So the emergence of the women's liberation movement in Britain in the late 1960s and its evolution in the 1970s has often been framed in the public imagination as a new social movement that emerged out of nowhere. As Karen often has written, and I quote, "A new generation of feminists in Europe thought, in good conscience, that they were beginning from year zero." And Pat Thane, who's done so much to uncover uncover the rich history of female activism across the 20th century, has observed that, and again I quote, "there seems to have been little contact between the older and newer women's organisations." Thane writes that the women's liberation movement was overwhelmingly a movement of younger women and tended to be hostile or indifferent to constitutional action through Parliament, which was the main means through which these older women's groups operated. That was their main way of performing activism. The British Library's Sisterhood and After research team, which oversees a wonderful oral history collection of women active in the women's liberation movement, describes the movement as one, and I quote, "formed of young women living in a period of rapid social and cultural change." So there's very much this association between the movement and youth, which is probably no surprise. So I have this one image, which I've been using, borrowed off the internet, which I probably shouldn't do, but it's an amazing image. These are 3 women actually protesting outside Margaret Thatcher's house in the 1980s. And then we have images that are much more typical of the women's liberation movement. with particularly younger women being represented here. So embracing the activism of the women's liberation movement, younger women appeared to reject the lifestyles and concerns of their own mothers and grandmothers, and with it, the more traditional housewives and voluntary women's organisations that their mothers and grandmothers may have joined. The perception, therefore, is that younger women were either unaware of or had little interest in belonging to these historic and more traditional women's groups, the groups that I included, or some of the groups that I included in my first book. So many excellent histories of the women's liberation movement in Britain have been published since the 1970s, and there are many of them, so I wasn't able to include them all here. But in more recent years, the work of historians, including Sarah Brown, Natalie Tomlinson, and George Stevenson, have expanded our understanding of the movement by focusing on its important intersections, the intersections of race and class within the movement, and highlighting that the movement wasn't just confined to London. It was happening in Scotland as well. Patrick will be pleased to know that. But yes, it was definitely going on there too. And elsewhere, I should emphasise. So there's also some really great new work currently being undertaken by ECR students, early career researchers, and PhD students, and there's some really exciting work starting to emerge. For example, Jessica White's work on black women activists and Becky Rutherford's work on disabled women's campaigns at this time. Yet despite these advances in knowledge, the overall perception remains that so-called second wave feminism, which is generally taken to mean the women's liberation movement, is associated primarily with younger women and not that relevant to the experiences or needs of middle-aged and older women. And I think this is further reflected in the key demands made by the women's liberation movement in England during the 1970s. So some of these were long-standing demands of previous women's organisations right from sort of early 1900s, and then newer ones around contraception and abortion. Well, actually, they were also longer standing, and childcare, and you can see those there. But if you look at those, they're very much reflecting some of the concerns that younger women would have at this time. Margarita Jolly, in her wonderful book, Sisterhood and After, which is based on oral history interviews of women's liberation movement activists, including the British Library collection. She captures this generational disconnect when she recalls, and I just take this quote from her book, the intake of breath almost all took when an interviewer asked them about their mothers, and indeed my own when I was asked. And this intake of breath suggests a negative response, a physical manifestation of the generational distance between these activists and their mother's generation. So just as I had wondered back in the late 1980s and the early 1990s about the silences around female activism and agency during the interwar years, I now got very curious about what had happened to the hundreds of thousands of women who joined historic women's organisations, such as the Women's Institutes, the Mothers' Union, the National Council of Women, the Townswomen's Guilds, and the Soroptimists during the 1960s and 1970s. If we jump forward to today, to 2022, all of these groups are still active, and all are still campaigning and engaging nationally and internationally in debates and campaigns around women's rights and gender equality. So how is it that they're missing in action during the 1960s and 1970s, and within accounts of the women's movement at this time? They do seem just to have disappeared. So the silences that exist within the current historiography of the women's movement seem to assume that during the latter decades of the 20th century, middle-aged and older women left the protesting and activism to the next generation. Now, of course, there are exceptions, and one example is Sharon Thompson's just published book on the Married Women's Association entitled Quiet Revolutionaries. But even the title of that book, and I can't wait to get my hands on it, it indicates that this is the quiet protest at this time. Overall, however, the experiences and activism of historic women's organisations and their members has been elided from the history of female activism during these years. And this is a mistake. So I'm sure you are all well aware of members of your own families or friends who have women within their families who continue to make significant contributions to society through their work and activism in later life. And in my own family, I have some great examples. So my paternal grandmother, Maureen, was an activist in the Irish Republican movement in the early 1920s and went on to take leadership roles in the Women Graduates Association and the Irish Country Women's Association. Funny enough, two of the organisations I researched for my MA, but didn't know that she was involved. So she took leadership roles in these groups in the 1950s when she herself was in her late 1950s. In her 50s. And I've just, I thought it was coming out today, but it didn't, which is frustrating. But I have an article with the conversation about my grandmother and discovering my grandmother's past, not all of it of which I was aware, which has been the most amazing experience. And I haven't enjoyed actually researching something so much in years. So it might be out tomorrow or the next day. Just keep an eye on my Twitter account, because don't you worry, I'll be tweeting about it when it does. And then I have my own mother, Margaret, who reinvented herself not once but twice in middle and older age, beginning her career as a social worker in her 40s, qualifying as a child and adolescent psychotherapist in her 60s, and working in that profession into her early 80s. And I have my mother-in-law, Margaret, who was an active member of the Seroptimus, which is all quite spooky when I'm now researching the Seroptimus. And she was an active member of the Wexford Club in Ireland right up to her death earlier this year. Looking to the UK, there are also many examples of women engaged in lifelong activism. One excellent one is Hazel Hunkins Hallahan, who you can see here in this lovely picture here, which I'll explain in a moment. So Hazel, having served prison time in the US in 1917, as a result of her militant suffrage activism, she was protesting outside the White House and was arrested and then went on hunger strike, so she was a militant suffragette. Hazel then moved to London in 1920 and joined the 6 Point Group in 1922, and this was a well-known post-suffrage feminist pressure group. Hazel served as its national secretary and as its chairman, and was still active in the group up until her death in 1982, aged 91. So I thought it was no coincidence, maybe, I don't know if you can see, it's a wee bit small, but it might be no coincidence, therefore, that on this report of the group's 1965 conference, one of the talks there listed in the top is the comeback of the mature woman. So I thought that might be the title of a book, I think. I mean, there's something definitely going on there. I'll have to think about that one. So the image that you can see here of Hazel was taken from an interview she gave to the Sunday Times on the 21st of September 1969. With the headline, Boudica, the Celtic queen, rides again, Hazel, then aged 78, was the chairman of the 6 Point Group. And she was asked to comment on the emergence of the women's liberation movement in the US and the UK. So the journalist describes meeting Hazel, and I quote, meeting Hazel in the serenity of her club, which I presume is what we can see in the background of the image here. So it was a perfect contrast to the Women's Liberation Workshop headquarters in Islington. So an immediate juxtaposition being drawn there. And the journalist quotes Hazel as saying, "Yes, I know about the Women's Liberation Workshop. They're young and utterly unsophisticated politically, but they're full of beans. The membership of our group, until recently, has been far too old for my liking." So this wonderful quote, which I found in the amazing press cuttings collection in the Women's Library at the LSE, it gives us an insight into the fact that historic women's groups, such as the 6 Point Group and their leaders, were aware of the newly emerging women's liberation movement, and in Hazel's case appeared to welcome this development amongst younger women. And this is important as it suggests assumptions about a gulf between the women's liberation movement and pre-existing women's organisations may not be as wide as previously thought. So the Beyond Women's Liberation Women's Liberation Project, which I'm working on, will map the interconnections between older women's organisations like the Women's Institutes, the Towns Women's Guilds, the National Council of Women, the Mothers Union and the 6 Point Group, with newly emerging women's groups from the 1960s onwards. The aim is to bring to the fore the experience and activism of women who were members of these historic women's groups. I also want to find out what these different groups thought about one another. We've nice early insight here from Hazel, but I'd like to know more. And I want to know if they ever worked together, because they had a common cause, of course, which was to achieve gender equality. So in doing this, I plan to utilise intergenerational theory to illuminate what intergenerational conflict may have existed between members of the women's liberation movement and more traditional women's organisations at this time. Here, the work of theorists, including Carl Meinheim and Norbert Elias, will be particularly useful in identifying, analysing and understanding the impact of intergenerational tensions and conflicts within the women's movement in the UK. I want to know how these tensions, if they're there, I suspect there will be some, how they might have limited the effectiveness and reach of the women's movement. Did the apparent rising power, public attention, and increased opportunities of the generation of younger women, many of whom got involved in the women's liberation movement, result in conflict with the older generation of activists? Did their association with domesticity and tradition contribute to that intake of breath that Margarita Jolly so vividly describes in her book? These are all new questions. This is very much a work in progress. It's always our disclaimer, isn't it? But these are all new questions that I'm hoping I'll be able to address as the new project evolves. So for now, I just want to give you an insight into some of the activities and concerns of 3 of these historic women's organisations during the 60s and 70s. But in the bigger project, I want to include a more diverse group of organisations. So just to give you a sense, I've mentioned these groups before, but just to remind you, so the Women's Institutes, the WI, I might refer to it, it's a bit shorter from now on, they represented rural women, and in the 1970s, you can see they had 442, just under 1,000, sorry, not great with numbers or graphs, 442,000-ish members. And the Mothers Union was an organisation, the largest women's organisation within the Church of England, and represented Anglican wives and mothers, and you can see its membership there. And the National Union of Towns Women's Guilds represented urban wives and mothers. But these are 3 organisations with substantial memberships at the late 1960s and early 1970s. So, however, just like Hazel Hunkins Hallinan, the leaders of all these 3 groups were expressing growing concern about declining and ageing memberships within their own organisations. Now, it's really difficult and frustratingly difficult to obtain any statistics with regards to age profiles of members. These weren't generally recorded, but it is, and it's something I want to do further work on to see if I can work a way around that problem. But it is clear from the minutes of the national committees of the organisations that I've looked at that ageing memberships begin to become more of a concern during these years. And perhaps they were right to be worried. For example, the Mothers Union was castigated in none other than the Church Times in June 1972. Here, Margaret Duggan wrote, and I quote, "Whether it is true or not, the image of the Mothers Union member in young eyes is that of an elderly woman who is content to spend just an hour away from her domestic chores to go and sit on a hard chair in a parish hall, listening to a speaker telling her how to snuggle yet deeper into her domestic, self-negating and virtuous cabbagehood." So yeah, there may have been a problem going on here. A public image, the optics don't look great. So Duggan's solution to this problem was that probably what is most needed is for a women's lib tornado to sweep through Mary Sumner House, which is the headquarters of the Mothers Union, right from its basement to the excellent cafeteria on the top floor, And blow out some of the windows while it's at it. I do like the excellent cafeteria. And it's a beautiful building. I did a lot of early archive research in Mary Sumner House. It's a lovely building. So there obviously there's a bit of a representation issue problem for the Mothers' Union. So there is no doubt that during the 1960s and 1970s, the Mothers' Union was perceived as a traditional, old-fashioned and socially conservative group, even within the Church of England. You know, be minded, this is published in the Church Times. It wasn't until 1973 that the union finally allowed divorced women and unmarried mothers to join. So we are talking about a conservative organisation. And as you can see, news of that, because it was quite big news, was published in the Times about the union admitting unmarried parents. But the other image might be a bit more of a surprise, and apologies, sorry, it is quite small. So this is an image from a 1970s leaflet entitled "What the Mothers' Union Does About Today's Social Problems," and lists some of the issues of concern to the union in the 1970s, many of which, when you look at the list, which includes the issues around battered wives and babies, loneliness, housing, rape sentencing, pensions. So a lot of issues that if maybe I took all the other information off, you might think were the issues being of concern to the women's liberation movement. So there's clear commonality of concern here. So despite its conservative stance on religious and moral questions, and it absolutely did have a conservative stance, the Mothers' Union regularly worked with other women's organisations to demand social policy reforms of benefit to women and their families. This included joining forces with the Women's Institute, the WI, the Townswomen's Guilds, and newer groups such as the Child Poverty Action Group. In 1973, these four organisations worked together to lobby the government to ensure that child benefit would continue to be paid directly to mothers in cash at their local post office. The objection was, the reason they needed to do this was there was a proposal by government that the allowance would be paid to fathers through bank accounts as opposed to the post office. And the reason this mattered, it might seem like a small issue, a small change, but actually it was incredibly important. And the Women's Institute magazine articulates this in an article in Home and Country, its magazine, in September 1972. Here it was stated, and I quote, that in marriages where the husband is tight with money, or where he is deserted or is unreliable, the fact that the woman can put her hands on the allowance will make all the difference. And remember, this is at a time when many women would not have been, and particularly full-time housewives, would have no other access to income. So the WI clearly recognised the dangers of economic dependency for women within marriage, which remains an issue today, just as the women's liberation movement did at the time. The action taken by the WI, the Mothers' Union, and other groups who were concerned about this reform ensured that any reform of child benefit continued to include payment made directly to mothers, as formalised under the 1975 Child Benefit Act. So the WI Mothers' Union, sorry, the problem with my work is I have all these long women's organisations' names to say every time, so sorry about that. But the WI Mothers' Union and Townswomen's Guilds came together once again to lobby the National Health Service to provide comprehensive facilities for routine smear tests for cervical cancer. Joint representations in March 1964 to the Minister of Health to demand that a nationwide programme of cervical cancer testing was to be expanded as quickly as possible. And it's worth noting that at this time, back in the 1960s, it was thought that older mothers were more at risk of developing cervical cancer. Obviously, the science and the knowledge has changed since then. But that might explain to us why these groups were so particularly concerned about this issue and were so active in calling for an expansion of screening. Their efforts to ensure that women benefited from this screening, from the screening programme, it continued well into the 1970s. And here, for example, I found in the WI's Public Affairs Subcommittee in 1973 that volunteer members of the WI were working with medical professionals in mobile caravan screening centres in order to get as many women as possible screened. And just again, I know it's tiny, but in 14 days, 2,000 women have participated and were screened in one, I think it was in Oxfordshire. Sorry, I can't quite remember. Oh, it was Westmoreland, which is impressive and shows that these groups are incredibly active in these kind of pragmatic ways of supporting women at this time. In June 1973, an editorial was published in the Mothers' Union News, the Mothers' Union magazine, exactly, I don't know if it was a coincidence, but exactly 1 year on from Margaret Duggan's scathing attack. And stated on that, this new article stated that the Mothers' Union is a movement for the liberation of women. That is not to say we are affiliating ourselves with Women's Lib, though we might well adopt their aim of raising the community's understanding of the position of women. But the Mothers' Union goes beyond this by demonstrating the Christian dimension, which is liberation itself. Now, I find this quote, it was one of those lovely quotes you think, this is just what I need. And it is a lovely quote because for a number of reasons. First of all, it's so interesting that the word liberation has been appropriated by the Mothers' Union. Very clearly, it's aware of the media attention and the excitement and the important contribution that the women's liberation is making. So it takes this word, but rather than that word being destructive tornado that Margaret Duggan wanted to happen in Mary Sumner House, instead, it's actually arguing, but we're also doing that, but in a different way. They don't want to go too far, so there you can see there's a quick row back when they say, that's not to say that we're affiliating ourselves with Women's Lib. But then, it's a really, really interesting quote if you deconstruct it. But they then go back and say, but we might well adopt their aim of raising communities' understanding about the position of women. So actually, yes, they do have quite a lot in common with what's happening in the women's liberation movement. So I think it's interesting, and it demonstrates that there's much more of a relationship and interconnection, perhaps, than has previously been acknowledged. So into the 1980s, the Mothers' Union, and I do hope in the wider project will go well into the 1980s. This is the plan at the moment. So you can see here a nice tantalising photo from the Mothers' Union archive at Lambeth Palace Library, which has a list of the kinds of topics and files and concerns that the Mothers' Union had. And once again, there are issues here that if I took away all the other identifiers, you might just assume these were connected perhaps to more typical kind of women's liberation movement activism. So you've got abortion, contraception, divorce and legitimacy, maternity benefits, obesity, quite prescient, prostitution, sexual offences, and it goes on, solvent misuse, nationality bill, because women didn't have the same access at the time. So, like the Mothers' Union, the Women's Institute was keen to flex its activist muscles throughout the 1960s and the 1970s. In 1971, the WI made clear its intention to become more vocal on social and political issues impacting on women's lives, and it already had been quite vocal, so it wanted to go even further. This change in policy, as you can see from this cutting from the Telegraph, with a very typical, if you research the WI, you really don't get very far without jam coming up. So, and this goes back to the WI's origins and the preservation. It was rural women during wartime, preservation of jam, and jam in Jerusalem, kind of Jerusalem being the anthem of the WI. So, politics replaces jam was the headline, but more interestingly, the article reported that the WI had voted to amend a 50-year-old rule prohibiting discussion on politics and religion, thereby giving the Institute, and I quote, its 500,000 members more say on world affairs and important domestic topics. This 1971 rule change was described in the article as ushering in a new look. So there's no doubt that this deliverance from self-censorship, although from my previous research, they actually did manage to do an awful lot of campaigning despite this rule, so they were quite clever getting around it. But the fact that they very publicly, and it's reported in the press, had decided to get rid of this self-censorship It allowed the facilitating and sharing of WI experience and expertise with members and policymakers with regards to women's health, welfare, and gender equality. And then another example, another great, it is the Telegraph again. These are, I was so lucky, this is a great cuttings file, press cutting, God bless press cuttings, and they're held at the LSE. The With It WI from the Telegraph, July 1975. So the second press cutting is interesting, again, apart from its headline, it's interesting because a direct link is made here by the journalist between the activities of the WI and the women's liberation movement. And I printed out there, but I will read it. So the article states that few would bracket the National Federation of Women's Institute, which we think of as home-loving, cosy, and devoted to preservation, with the more revolutionary breed of women's liberation groups. Yet there are very few demands now being made by women's liberationists, which their older sisters in the WI have not made already. At a glance, their track record shows that there is really very little new under the sun. For a sample resolution that men and women should receive equal pay for equal work, no, not a daring concept from 1975, but one carried at the annual general meeting of 1943, which was true. Now, reading this, we have to remember this is from the Telegraph, and I think we'd be safe in suggesting that this praise for the WI in the Telegraph was quite a useful way for the paper, right-wing paper, to have a dig at the women's liberation movement. Indeed, the article goes on to say that, and I quote, "The new woman of the 60s and 70s is a media myth." So I think there's fake news clearly going on here. It's a media myth, and they're not so different from their mother or their grandmother. So this is a real attempt here at the time to refute any generational discord. And moreover, the article, biased as it might be, I think does serve as a useful reminder about the continuities in activism on the part of the WI throughout the 20th century, linking concerns of 1943 around equal pay right up to the 1975 when the 1970 Equal Pay Act was introduced and then comes into operation a number of years later. So throughout the 1970s, the WI campaigned around a range of welfare concerns, including family planning, child benefit, pensions, domestic violence, and the rights of disabled housewives. Yet its activities continue often to be excluded from the histories of post-1968 activism, feminism, and the women's movement. So I think it's significant that the WI was not only happy to work alongside the Mothers' Union and the Townswomen's Guilds in joint campaigns, which I've mentioned already, but was also open to building relationships with newer groups. One example was the Child Poverty Action Group, which it campaigned with around child benefit payments, but also the new National Housewives Register. In July 1972, the WI's Public Affairs Committee noted that it was keen to work with the National Housewives Register, an organisation which was set up in 1960 and mostly attracted educated middle-class women aged between 25 and 40. It was felt, however, in the committee notes, that these women, the Housewives Register women, weren't as keen to join the WI, and I quote, because it was felt that there was not enough meat on WI programmes. So I have to presume by the term meat, they mean sort of topical, substantive issues of the day. Although this obviously was a misnomer because the WI was engaged in these issues at the time. So I think here again is another insight into the possible disconnects between older and newer women's organisations at the time. And if you're interested in learning more about the National Housewives Register and some of the other groups that emerged in the 1960s, Professor Lynn Abrams' work on this group and others is really excellent, and I would send you in that direction. So throughout the 1970s, the WI was engaged in a wide range of campaigns on behalf of women ranging from cervical cancer testing, I've already mentioned, to access to family planning and consumer and pension rights. In 1972, it called on the government to make it mandatory rather than permissive as a present for all local authorities to provide full, free family planning services. And it was very keen and lobbied Barbara Castle, then Minister of Health, to ensure that family planning products would be available from local GPs to make it much easier for women to get access. And then just to turn, as I start to finish up, to the National Union of Townswomen's Guilds. So the Townswomen's Guilds were modelled on the Women's Institute, but they targeted women in urban, not rural areas. And they're often dismissed within histories of the women's movement as being a conservative housewives association from the 1950s. However, I would argue that they played a key role in a number of campaigns linked to women's rights and gender equality throughout the 1960s and 1970s. This included sentencing reform, the financial position of widows, and access to higher quality maternity services. In 1965, the Townswomen's Guilds passed a resolution on abortion, calling on the government to introduce legal abortion for women, and I quote, where it is necessary to preserve her physical or mental health, where there is a serious risk of a defective child being born, where pregnancy results from a sexual offence. And this resolution was passed by an overwhelming majority, and it came 2 years before the 1967 Abortion Act and 5 years before the women's liberation movement called for abortion on demand. So I think that that is significant and important and something that we need to think about. So the guilds, however, didn't have the Townswomen's Guilds didn't have as much success, passing a 1978 resolution calling for an expansion of NHS menopausal clinics. Bingo. House, maybe, I don't know. Yeah. So this resolution from 1978 highlighted the scarcity of provision for women with menopausal disorders. And it called on the government and asked the government to consider it as a matter of urgency the establishment of additional menopausal clinics. And you can see the resolution there. Those speaking in favour of the resolution, for example, Mrs. Chris Hicks, argued that at the national meeting where these resolutions were debated, that menopausal women who had to work through the menopause needed help and not tranquilizers. And this is such a prescient point, especially today when you had Caroline Harris on the Today programme talking about the recommendations of the All-Party Parliamentary Committee, and she herself was prescribed antidepressants for years before it was realised that actually she wasn't needing antidepressants, but she was suffering from menopausal symptoms. So clearly, the prescription of tranquilizers is nothing new and was happening back in the 1970s. So this important issue for kind of middle-aged and older women, which doesn't appear anywhere, as far as I'm aware yet, again, it's a work in progress, in the demands for the women's liberation movement. It was actually narrowly defeated. So this didn't pass as a resolution. It wasn't passed, and therefore they didn't lobby on this issue as an organisation. So the motion was narrowly defeated, but it does lead to one of my favourite newspaper article headings, which is "Hot Flush Gets Cold Shoulder." Whoever, they must have been really slapping themselves on the back that day when they came up with that headline. I do think it's wonderful. So in the article in the Townswoman, which is the organisation's own magazine, it stated that the main reason for the defeat of this resolution was concerns of diverting NHS resources away from more important conditions, for example, cancer care. I think the defeat is telling, as it indicates us that even amongst guild members themselves, the health and welfare of middle-aged and older women was viewed to be of lesser importance than the health needs of the rest of the population, where there was scarcity of provision. So I am going to draw things to a close. We are getting there. I hope this snapshot of the vibrancy and diversity of activism undertaken by the Mothers' Union, the WI, and the Townswomen's Guilds during the late 1960s and the 1970s shines a brighter light on the activities of these groups. Instead of retreating into the shadows or downing tools, thereby allowing a new generation of younger women to take their place, these historic women's groups became even more vocal in the late 1960s and into the 1970s, campaigning for social and political reforms that would enhance the lives of their members. Their activism ran in parallel with the women's liberation movement, complementing its new and different focus on challenging gender norms, the needs of younger women, the intersection of race, class and sexuality, and the desire to organise in a much more radical and non-hierarchical way. We need to find out much more about how these two strands of the women's movement interacted, how they sparked off one another, what they shared and learnt from each other. My initial research shows that they intersected much more frequently than has previously been acknowledged. There was undoubtedly intergenerational conflict and tension, and this needs to be further explored. But the idea that the activism of younger and older women for gender equality happened in separate spaces and was diametrically opposed during the 1960s and 1970s is no longer viable. So going beyond women's liberation brings the experiences, expertise and voices of middle-aged and older women activists in from the margins. And this matters for a number of reasons. It results in a more complete and inclusive history of the 20th century women's movement. It reopens debates around the use of the wave metaphor and calls for a flattening of the second wave in response to the now made visible ongoing activism of historic women's organisations. It pays attention to the activism, needs and demands of middle-aged and older women, and on how this cohort of women can be better supported, an issue which is taking on increasing importance today in our ageing society. And finally, it challenges the notion of decline within social movement theory. The women's liberation movement in the UK may have petered out by the early 1980s, but its radical ideas, along with the activism of more traditional women's organisations, ensured that a wider women's movement endured, and it continues to endure, and to fight the fight for women's rights right up to the present day. Thank you.